All Americans, all murdered by illegal aliens released by Democrats instead of being deported. So, what else is out of control?
A United States senator stood on the Senate floor, listed 5 names, and dared anyone in that chamber to argue with them. Lake Riley, Jocelyn Nungeri, Kayla Hamilton, Dara Thompson, Haley Pegasus. 5 Americans, 5 names attached to 5 deaths. All of them, he said, murdered by individuals who should have been removed from this country but were not, because political decisions prioritized something other than their safety. That was the moment Senator Schmitt stopped arguing about procedure and made it personal. And the silence that followed those 5 names is the most important thing you will hear in this entire breakdown. Stay with me until the end, because what Schmitt exposed about why Democrats are fighting this hard to protect the current system is something that goes much deeper than a policy disagreement. If this is the kind of content that cuts through the noise for you, hit like and subscribe right now. You are going to want to be here for this.
All Americans, all murdered by illegal aliens released by Democrats instead of being deported. So, what else is out of control other than the Democrats' language? These leftist activist organizations that are creating the chaos in the streets. There are nine sanctuary jurisdictions in this country that actually probably are significant. In those 9 sanctuary jurisdictions, there is a 590% increase for anti-ICE attacks. They are creating conditions with the hope that they get some viral moment. This is dangerous. This is out of control. One more thing that's out of control, sanctuary jurisdictions writ large. And for the friends watching at home, what is a sanctuary jurisdiction that the Democrats are so proud of? They are local jurisdictions that will not tell federal law enforcement when an illegal alien rapist or murderer is being released from prison. It happened, by the way, the new Virginia governor just pledged that she won't do it. The monster, Abdul Jahala from Sierra Leone with 30 priors, who stabbed to death a fellow citizen of ours, she has pledged to not let ICE know when that monster is released from prison. That's who they are. That's what we're fighting against. And we're not going to allow them to kneecap our federal law enforcement from getting these monsters out of our country. They just voted against this. They just voted against the Coast Guard. They just voted against Secret Service. They just voted against TSA. They want to undermine law enforcement and give blanket amnesty to 15 million people here illegally. That's the truth. And with that, Mr. President, I object.
When a political debate produces 5 names, it has moved past the stage of competing policy frameworks and landed somewhere more consequential. Names are not abstractions. They are not statistics. They are not talking points. They are people who existed, had families, and are no longer here. And when a senator places 5 of them on the record in the middle of floor debate about federal law enforcement funding, the burden of response falls on everyone in that chamber. Schmitt placed those names on the record. The response from the other side was silence on the specifics and continued procedural maneuvering on the broader question. The debate itself was framed by Democrats as a reform argument. Senator Schiff and his colleagues argued that agencies within the Department of Homeland Security could not receive additional funding until accountability measures were in place. Body cameras, judicial warrants, standards equivalent to local law enforcement. These are not frivolous demands on their face. Accountability in law enforcement is a principle that most Americans across the political spectrum would say they support in the abstract. But Schmitt identified the mechanism being used to advance those demands. The mechanism was a government shutdown. Agencies that have nothing to do with immigration enforcement, the Coast Guard, the Transportation Security Administration, the Secret Service, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency, were being held without funding as leverage to force concessions on immigration policy. Schmitt noted that the same members of Congress arguing for the Coast Guard's importance had just voted against a measure that would fund it. The vote is public record. The contradiction is not a matter of interpretation. This is worth sitting with because it illustrates something specific about how legislative leverage works. When you attach unrelated agencies to a policy demand and then withhold funding from those agencies to force compliance, you're not actually arguing that those agencies should be defunded. You are using them as hostages. The Coast Guard does not enforce immigration law. The TSA does not conduct deportations. The Secret Service protects elected officials, including the very senators making these arguments. Holding their funding to extract immigration concessions is a choice that reveals where the actual priorities sit. Schmitt made the sanctuary jurisdiction argument with specific data that deserves examination. He cited a 590% increase in incidents directed at federal immigration officers across 9 identified sanctuary jurisdictions. That figure, if accurate, represents a significant public safety pattern. Sanctuary policies, by design, limit the communication between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities. The stated rationale is that immigrant communities will be more willing to cooperate with local police on non-immigration matters if they do not fear that contact with law enforcement will trigger federal action. That is a coherent argument. The counter-argument, which Schmitt advanced, is that the practical effect of these policies includes a release of individuals with violent criminal histories back into communities without notification to federal authorities who could detain and remove them. He cited the case of Abdul Ezdi, described as having 30 prior offenses before committing a fatal stabbing. He noted that the incoming governor of Virginia had pledged not to notify federal authorities upon the release of such individuals. That pledge is a policy choice with real consequences for real people. And those consequences have names. Schiff's floor argument deployed specific rhetorical language. He described federal enforcement operations using terms that invoke the imagery of military occupation and historical atrocity. The word Gestapo appeared. The imagery of stormtroopers entered the debate. Schmitt responded to this language directly and with visible frustration. He called it dangerous. He was not wrong to do so. Here is why the language matters beyond the political performance of the moment. When you use a vocabulary of the worst atrocities in human history to describe the routine enforcement of civil immigration law, you do two things simultaneously. You elevate the emotional temperature to the debate in a way that forecloses rational argument, and you implicitly license a response proportional to the severity of the accusation. If federal immigration officers are Gestapo, then opposing them is resistance. If the administration is the Third Reich, then any action taken against it is justified by the moral weight of that comparison. This is not a small rhetorical choice. It is a framework with consequences that extend well beyond a Senate floor debate. Schmitt pointed to the 900 incidents directed at federal officers in sanctuary jurisdictions and drew a line between the rhetoric and the violence. That line is not a proven causal chain, but the correlation between the escalation of that language and the escalation of physical confrontations with federal law enforcement is a pattern that deserves honest examination rather than dismissal. The deeper argument that Schmitt was making, the one beneath the specific policy disagreements, is about accountability for outcomes. The current situation at the border, the backlog in the immigration system, the presence of a significant undocumented population, including individuals with violent criminal histories, did not emerge from nowhere. It was produced by a series of policy decisions made over years that prioritized certain outcomes over others. Schmitt argued that the party now blocking enforcement mechanisms is the same party whose policy choices created the conditions requiring enforcement. That argument, if the underlying facts support it, has significant implications for how the current debate should be evaluated. On the question of USAID, Schmitt referenced an ongoing investigation into whether funding streams from that agency were being directed in ways that benefited the political infrastructure of the Democratic Party. That allegation is serious and is being examined through appropriate oversight channels. Whether it proves out or not, the fact that it is being investigated while the same political actors are aggressively resisting the operational capacity of federal law enforcement creates a context that voters are entitled to consider. What this floor exchange ultimately represents is a collision between two fundamentally different ways of framing the same situation. One frame says the system is being abused by an administration overreaching its authority, and that accountability measures are the appropriate response. The other frame says the system failed to function for years, produced measurable harm to American citizens, and that the resistance to corrective enforcement is either ideological, self-protective, or both. Both frames cannot be entirely correct. But both frames contain elements that deserve honest engagement rather than rhetorical escalation. Schmitt gave the escalation a name. He gave it 5 names. And in a debate that had drifted very far from the human cost of the policy choices being made, that grounding was the most powerful thing said on that floor.